Welcome.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks to all of you. Thanks, John and Todd and the whole team for inviting me here. It is great to be here, and you guys are wondering, why am I listening to a history professor? This has been an amazing 2 days of talking about building the future, about what's next, about what we can expect, what we can imagine in the next 5 years, 10 years, and that is what the technology industry has been so extraordinary at doing. There is a room full of people with smartphones in their pockets that have more computing power than the mega computers that powered the Cold War, than the rockets that sent astronauts to the moon in the 1960s. And there is this extraordinary track record of expansion and achievement is something that makes me so interested as an American historian in how that happened. How did we get to now? How did we get to an American-based, American-dominated technology economy where the 5 biggest companies alone have combined market caps that are upwards of $2.7 trillion? A nation in which there are 1,100 computers for every 1,000 people. And how does the story of American technology relate to the bigger story of American history? And why should we care? Well, I think we should care because if you're building the future, history can be your most powerful weapon. Understanding how we got here, how we got to now, is a way to prepare for and understand what the now is, why things are the way they are, the great things, and also the not so great things. Understanding both the incredible opportunities presented by new and emerging technologies and existing technologies, and also the unanticipated consequences. History is also important, I think, particularly now for a technology industry, a global technology industry, that is now at the center of nearly everything. Software is powering everything. Every company now is a technology company. And this is something that is new. This is something that hasn't always been with us. And because technology companies are so front and center, and so the tools that they have developed are ones that billions of people use every day. They are now getting the heat and light of the spotlight, the political spotlight, the media spotlight, in the way that other big dominant industries of earlier eras did in the past. The age of the great railroads of the late 19th century, of steel and oil in the early 20th century, of Detroit's big 3 automakers in the middle part of the 20th century. Now, the technology industry, a technology industry that is intensively clustered in certain places in the world and in the United States, now has a heck of a lot of attention played on it. And so this is both a challenge and an opportunity. It's an opportunity for people in the industry to understand how it relates to this broader tapestry of American political history and cultural history, and also an opportunity and a necessity for the industry and industry people and leaders and these incredibly creative minds who have brought these fantastic products to market to step forth and sit at the table with other leaders in the private sector, other public sector leaders, nonprofit sector leaders, to figure out where we go from here. And so to show you, I want to begin this history lesson and understanding why this knowledge of history can be so powerful and empowering by talking about the president and Russia. Different president. So in the spring of 1988, Ronald Reagan, who 4 years before had declared the Soviet Union an evil empire, had visited Moscow for the first time. This was the season of Gorbachev, of glasnost, of perestroika, of a new thawing in relations, nearly the very end of the Cold War. And he gave a speech. The optics of it must have been the White House advance team's nightmare, right? They tried to get the organizers to cover the statue, but apparently that didn't go over. And he is giving a speech at Moscow State University, which, if those of you in this business know, is the elite technical university of at the time in the Soviet Union. He's giving a speech in front of 600 engineering students, the best, the top of their class, the future leaders of the technology industry. And he starts talking about revolution. He doesn't talk about the founding fathers. He doesn't even talk about the Reagan Revolution or the conservative revolution. He talks about microchips. And he says there is a revolution going on in the world today. It is a bloodless revolution, but it is transforming everything. And its agent is this little device, a tiny device smaller than your fingernail. And it is changing the world. And then Reagan goes on to talk about how this is an extraordinary product of American freedom and democracy, that this entrepreneurial explosion that came out of the United States, particularly in the personal computer industry, with companies like Microsoft in the 1980s, is proof positive of the free enterprise system at work. And Ronald Reagan was right. It was an only in America story that the United States in the 20th century became this incredibly hospitable environment for entrepreneurial activity, for people to come up with great ideas and be able to execute on them, for these companies to start in garages and to grow to become multi-trillion-dollar enterprises. But it was only part of the story, because it wasn't purely a free enterprise story. It was a story of a society, a culture, and a government that created conditions, not always intentionally, but incredibly fruitful conditions for a tech industry to grow. It was conditions like that the Manhattan Project and the Cold War that built these massive supercomputers, creating research centers at universities and at federal research facilities, a lot of them in this part of the country, that fostered this new developments of computing, of first vacuum tube powered and then transistor powered computing. Again, this very deep-pocketed venture capitalist that was the US military and other US agencies that are spending lots and lots of money on scientific R&D, and particularly on the development of computer hardware and software. But it wasn't just a whole bunch of money. It was how that money was spent. And a great example is what happens when in the 1960s, when the attention turns to aerospace and bringing a man to the moon. Because this creates whole new streams of government spending that are focused on fostering the development of really small, really lightweight electronics. What are places that are really good at developing really strong, really lightweight electronics? Well, one of the centers of that was Northern California, the Bay Area. And what happens in the area that later becomes known as Silicon Valley in the 1960s is that you have a whole bunch of federal money coming in that's this ground floor for a competitive marketplace where small companies are competing with one another for contracts. So it wasn't just government pork coming from Washington to develop certain types of integrated circuits or transistors or oscillators or radar. It was a competitive contractual marketplace where small companies could get a toehold and have an opportunity to grow with a guarantee of a very deep-pocketed customer before there was a commercial market for any of the products. So think about the foundational technologies that are animating all of the devices in this room today, the devices that Microsoft is developing, marketing, and selling, that other companies, Seattle-based, Bay Area-based, other around the world-based, are developing. These are foundational technologies are coming from this moment. And other things matter too, this only in America story. It's the free movement of people. And the unique American situation of having open doors, both in its universities and increasingly its immigration policies, to immigrants and refugees from around the world, people like Andy Grove, who emigrated here as a teenager from Eastern Europe, as a refugee, who goes on to become CEO of Intel. And Immigrant Stories again and again and again, culminating in so many of the people who've inhabited this stage over the last 2 days. This again is distinctive about, this is going back to, only in America, only in the United States. This is a product of American history. This is a product of public policy choices that allowed this to grow. And so even after the big rush of defense spending goes down and new commercial markets spring up, where does high tech grow? It grows in places that were centers of defense spending, centers that had this university activity around computer hardware, software development, that had this research expertise, where you have people who are literally the children of that era. Steve Wozniak's father was an engineer at Lockheed Aerospace, Space and Missile in Sunnyvale, California. He was there, and he was learning about computers because of this Cold War economy. Same thing goes with Seattle, another defense hub, another place that had a research university that had a computer lab, when a lot of places didn't have computer labs. Where you have opportunities for young kids to get their hands on computers, to start playing with software, to be in an atmosphere where there is lots of expertise around them. And so this idea that you could start your own software company or your own hardware company and grow at large becomes something that's a reasonable possibility and probability. But for a long time, high tech was still, even as big as these companies came, they still were kind of off to the side of the main narrative of American history. You look at history textbooks, right? The textbook you read in high school. You learn about presidents, you learn about wars, you learn about all sorts of things. There might be a section on the tech industry, right? Oh, these guys making these funny things. But it was still not central. The first time Microsoft made the Seattle Times and any sort of editorial coverage in the Seattle Times was on Christmas Eve, 1980. This is after it signed the IBM deal. It's been in business. The guys have been in business for several years. BASIC is the platform of choice, operating system of choice for the microcomputer industry, which is still very small. And that's the first time there's any mention of Microsoft, and it's kind of in passing, talking about office parks in Bellevue. So there was not this recognition that the centrality of the technology industry. And part of this had to do with geography. So the technology industry grew up, in many cases, in suburban places, off to the side. So you look at what became Silicon Valley, which prior to now was originally a rural landscape of orchards. The biggest export of the Santa Clara Valley in the 1920s was prunes. It was the prune capital of the world. If any Seattleites want to needle any Bay Area people, you can say, you're from the prune capital of the world. But no longer. But one of the things that, one of these legacies, not only do we have these legacies of this big surge of defense spending in the 50s and 60s that shape the products that are developed and what the possibilities are technologically, it shapes where technology grows. And it grows often in research parks, suburban research parks, away from the cities. There was a deliberate effort. Stanford set a model of being a first university to establish a research park next to its campus, and very deliberately designed it so that it would kind of blend in with the suburban surroundings of Palo Alto around it. And Stanford's model and the mid-20th century suburban corporate research park model that we see on both the East and the West Coast is something that becomes kind of, when you think of tech for a very long time, it was in a suburban campus. When Microsoft expands beyond its original facilities in Bellevue, it moves to a campus in Redmond, the Googleplex in Mountain View. And then internationally, here's Microsoft's offices in Bangalore. Again, peripheral to the center of the city, its own contained development, has its own infrastructure, own utilities. And here's, in Singapore, similar peripheral, often government-sponsored, and public-private collaborative developments that grow on the periphery, but they're self-contained. And so this is one of the reasons that we have kind of this separation between the growth of this amazing this engine of the technology industry and the rest of the world. But now things are changing. Now we have technology coming back to the city at the same time that technology companies, both large, medium, and small, are having an even more immediate, more giant, more recognizable impact on the way people live, the way they work, the way they communicate, the way they vote, the way that they relate to one another. Everyone's talking about technology companies. They're at the center of the consciousness in the way that they were not in an earlier era. And now they're in the center of cities. And all of a sudden, these isolated research parks are now right in the middle of these very crowded urban places. And suddenly, people are saying, well, technology companies are the reason why this is going wrong, that's going wrong, the other is going wrong. But it isn't as though as we can see, this is a room filled with human beings. Companies are filled with people. And so the answer to where technology might go from here is in the people. Because these are not just companies that are coming to cities to disrupt and to displace, but they are full of incredibly talented, incredibly socially minded people who are thinking about these broader questions and wondering how their work can have an impact on it. And quite frankly, particularly because you have these companies have grown to such size, the products are so ubiquitous, that it is time to step to the table and be part of the solution. So I am bullish on tech. I'm bullish on the technology. I have seen the trajectory of technological, sort of incredible technological growth, and again, the supercomputers we all carry around in our pockets. It's underscored to me even more strongly the more that I learn about the history of the technology industry. But what I also have learned is that you cannot say, oh, what goes on with politics and government has nothing to do with us, or urban planning and the business of cities doesn't have anything to do with us. We just need to be heads down, developing really great technology, and that's going to fix it. That's not going to work anymore. It has to do with the size of the industry, the influence of the industry, the fact that software truly has eaten the world. And this is an opportunity. This isn't a time for battle. This isn't a time to take sides. This is a time to think about what does changing the world really mean, and how can we engage, and how can we use history as our most powerful weapon in doing so. So here's to the future. Thank you.